On the outskirts of the city where the rain fell like it was trying to wash away all the pain the world held, something extraordinary happened. Not with fireworks or fanfare, but with silence, kindness, and a yellow taxi. The streets were mostly empty that night except for a few silhouettes moving quickly under flickering streetlights, each trying to escape the cold sting of the downpour. Most people rushed to warmth and safety, but one girl named Linda had nowhere to go. She wasn't just cold from the storm, she was frozen in fear, huddled against a guardrail like someone trying to disappear. Now I want you to imagine the kind of fear that makes you shrink into yourself, the kind that makes your voice retreat and your eyes scan every corner for danger. That was Linda in that moment. Her dress clung to her skin, her makeup was smeared from tears and rain, and surrounding her were three men, predatory, circling, laughing. They saw her vulnerability as an invitation. But then out of nowhere came a streak of light headlights piercing through the storm, and with it a yellow cab screeched to a halt. The driver's door flung open, and out stepped Jack, a tall, rain-soaked young man with the kind of calm resolve that made people think twice. He didn't hesitate, didn't weigh his options, didn't pull out a phone or wait for backup. He walked right up to those men, and with the kind of voice that cut through even the loudest thunder, told them to back off. And they did. That's the thing about certain kinds of people. They don't need weapons to be powerful, just presence. Jack wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful by the world's standards. He drove a beat-up taxi to make ends meet. But that night, he was everything Linda needed: safe, strong, and silent when silence mattered. He helped her into the cab, didn't ask questions, didn't even ask for a fare. He just drove, letting the rhythm of the windshield wipers fill the space between them. This is where our story begins, not with a rescue, but with a decision. A decision to stop, to care, to see someone not as a problem or a liability, but as a person who needed shelter. Think about that. How often do we pass by people in pain, convincing ourselves someone else will help? Jack didn't. He chose to stop, and that choice changed both their lives. As they drove through the quieter parts of the city, Linda's voice finally cracked through the silence. "I just need somewhere. No one will find me tonight," she whispered. Jack nodded and took her to a park he sometimes went to when the noise of the world got too loud. And in that quiet place, he gave her tissue space in a moment of peace without expectations. And that was it. She left that night without telling him her last name, and he didn't ask. But something unspoken had been planted between them, something fragile and impossible to define. The next few days went on like any other. Jack returned to work. He picked up fares, avoided traffic, and glanced occasionally at the back seat, half expecting to see her again. And here's something important I want to point out. Not all heroes are loud. Some are quiet. Some just drive taxis and listen. But they show up. And that matters. This story isn't just about romance. It's about the moments that test our character when no one is watching. The times we can choose to ignore or to act. And Jack chose to act. The next chapter of this story doesn't open with a dramatic twist, but with something subtle, a knock on the window of Jack's taxi. 4 days after the rainy night, Jack was finishing a shift downtown, trying to forget the weight that had unexpectedly clung to his thoughts since that encounter with Linda. And that's when it happened. A black limousine, sleek, polished, completely out of place next to Jack's worn yellow cab, rolled up and stopped right in front of him. The contrast was striking: old versus new, humble versus powerful. A chauffeur in a tailored suit stepped out and handed Jack a crisp envelope with only a few words: "Miss Linda requests your presence." That moment alone could have made anyone suspicious or even fearful. But for Jack, it sparked something else: curiosity, and a quiet hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel until then. Let's pause for a second and reflect. How many of us would have thrown that invitation away, convinced we were being set up or worse, laughed at? The world doesn't often hand unexpected invitations to people who live paycheck to paycheck. So when it does, our instinct is often to recoil, to assume it's too good to be true. But Jack didn't. He showed up. And that alone already tells you something about his character. The address led him to Evergreen Lane, a private street most people only see in movies or on glossy magazine covers. Jack's taxi, the same one that had protected Linda in the rain, looked painfully out of place among manicured hedges and luxury cars. But still, he parked, straightened his jacket, and stepped forward. The doors of the estate opened before he could knock. And there she was, Linda. Not the soaked, trembling girl he'd helped just nights before, but poised, elegant, standing in a silk dress that shimmered under the foyer lights. The transformation was stunning, but what struck Jack most wasn't the clothes or the makeup. It was the way she smiled when she saw him. Soft, genuine, grateful. She didn't start with explanations or apologies. She simply said, "Hi, Jack. I'm glad you came." That moment was everything. In a house that screamed wealth and status, it was her humility that filled the room. As they walked through the mansion to a private dining room, already set for two, Jack remained quiet, unsure of how to process the surreal turn of events. The meal was perfect: salmon, roasted vegetables, warm bread. But it wasn't the food that made the night unforgettable. It was the truth that followed. Linda revealed that her full name was Linda Fairchild, daughter of Richard Fairchild, one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. She explained that on the night Jack had found her, she was supposed to attend her engagement party, a business arrangement designed by her father to marry her into another wealthy family. But the man was manipulative, deceitful, and Linda had finally had enough of being treated like a pawn. So she ran. And Jack was the only person who helped her that night, not because of who she was, but because of how she looked scared and human. Here's where commentary becomes essential. In a world where social status often dictates how people are treated, Linda's story reminds us that wealth doesn't protect you from emotional pain, isolation, or control. It simply wraps those wounds in expensive packaging. And Jack, someone from a completely different world, saw through all of it, not because he tried to, but because he didn't care about the wrapping. This is where real connections are born, not in mansions or bank accounts, but in moments where someone sees the real you and stays anyway. Linda thanked Jack properly that night, but not with money. She offered him something more powerful: truth and trust. And Jack, true to form, refused any form of payment. "I didn't help you to get something," he told her. "I helped you because it felt right." That response speaks volumes. In a society so transactional that we often forget how to give without expecting, Jack stood as a rare example of what it means to act from integrity. They ended the night as equals, not as heiress and taxi driver, but as two people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable. And something quietly profound had started to take root between them. Something they couldn't yet name, but neither of them wanted it to end. From that night forward, Jack and Linda began carving out a space in the world where none of the rules applied, a place where wealth, status, and background didn't matter, only the truth of who they were. It didn't start with declarations of love or dramatic gestures. It started with a simple text a few days later: "Want to go for a ride? Just me. Just freedom." That was Linda's message. No pretense. No press. Just two people seeking peace from a world that demanded too much from both of them. From that moment on, Jack became her unofficial getaway driver. Whenever the weight of boardrooms, expectations, and appearances became too much, she'd call him and he'd show up in his old yellow cab, never asking where, never needing a plan. These weren't grand adventures by anyone else's standards. Their first escape was to a food truck hidden behind a warehouse, where they sat on the hood of the taxi eating grilled cheese sandwiches wrapped in paper wind, tugging at their napkins. Linda laughed between bites, admitting she hadn't eaten anything off a paper plate in years. That moment wasn't just casual, it was radical. For someone raised in a world where everything was curated and scheduled, choosing messy, unfiltered moments was an act of rebellion. But more than that, it was healing. Let's talk about the real-life impact of moments like these. Studies have shown that people raised in high-pressure environments, especially those from high-wealth families, often struggle with authenticity. They're constantly performing, constantly shaping themselves to meet expectations. That freedom to just exist, to be messy, to laugh without worrying how you look, that's not just a luxury, it's a lifeline. Another day, Linda convinced Jack to rent bikes from a rundown shop by the riverfront. They rode through a park, weaving between trees and laughing as Linda nearly toppled over, dodging a squirrel. She wore jeans and a baseball cap, no makeup, no designer accessories, just her real and free. And Jack, he couldn't stop smiling. The more they escaped, the more they shed the weight of who they were expected to be. They played games like guessing strangers' professions. "That guy's definitely a dentist," Linda would say. "No one smiles that wide unless they sell it." Jack pointed at another person and said, "See those boots, librarian, but one who secretly reads crime thrillers at midnight." These games might seem trivial, but they built something priceless: intimacy. Not the kind that's flaunted on social media, but the kind rooted in shared joy, safe spaces, and mutual curiosity. It's easy to fall in love with someone's story, their image, their highlight reel. But Jack and Linda were falling in love with each other's silence, their weird thoughts, their vulnerabilities. This isn't fiction, it reflects something real about human connection. Relationship experts often say the strongest bonds form not during extravagant vacations or lavish dates, but during the quiet, ordinary moments. Eating greasy food together, sitting in silence after a long day, laughing about nothing. These are the moments that stick. And in these moments, Linda found something she had never known before: acceptance without performance. She began to open up about her childhood in a mansion that echoed with staff but lacked warmth. She talked about always being told how to walk, speak, dress, and think, how even her laughter had to be measured. And Jack listened not with pity but with understanding. He shared his own stories of growing up in a working-class neighborhood, fixing cars with his dad, and dreaming about life outside the city's corners. They came from different worlds, but their hearts spoke the same language: truth. And then came the night of the fireworks. It was a local festival, one neither of them had planned to attend, but they stumbled upon it during a drive and parked in an empty field outside the park. They sat on the hood of the taxi again, wrapped in a blanket, watching bursts of color light up the sky. Linda leaned back, eyes on the explosions, and whispered, "This is the first time in years I feel like I'm not performing." Jack turned to her and replied, "Maybe this is who you really are." She looked at him, her face lit softly by the glow of pink and blue firebursts, and asked, "And who are you, Jack?" He hesitated and then said quietly, "Someone who's trying not to fall for someone way out of his league." That confession didn't crash the moment. It deepened it. Linda smiled, not the perfect smile of a debutante, but the real one of a woman who felt seen. As another firework cracked overhead, their hands brushed. Jack froze, embarrassed, and quickly pulled away. "Sorry," he said, but Linda shook her head gently. "Don't be." That was it. No kiss, no dramatic music. Just two people sharing a moment that neither of them could explain, but both of them felt deeply. This is the essence of modern storytelling that audiences connect with, not because it's big or glamorous, but because it's honest. And that honesty in a world full of mass is the most romantic thing of all. They thought they had escaped the noise, that somehow by staying small and quiet, they could slip beneath the radar of a world obsessed with names and headlines. But peace, as it turns out, has an expiration date, especially when the world discovers your secret. It started with a single photo. A paparazzo hidden behind a dumpster outside a food truck snapped a picture of Linda and Jack laughing over sandwiches. Then came another Linda in jeans and no makeup, her hand brushing Jack's as they sat on the hood of his taxi under a streetlight. What had been a private connection now became public property. The media seized it instantly like sharks drawn to the scent of scandal. Headlines screamed across screens and newsstands. Heiress on the run, billionaire's daughter caught slumming with taxi driver, lover rebellion. And just like that, the world tried to define something it didn't understand. Let's stop here for a moment and talk about real life. When stories like this hit the media, they're rarely told with accuracy. Instead, they become projections of our own fantasies, judgments, and insecurities. We turn real people into characters, heroes, or villains based on nothing but our own narratives. This happens every day, especially to women in the spotlight. Their agency is stripped, their choices dissected, and their love stories mocked if they don't fit a specific mold. Linda was no longer just Linda. She became a symbol of defiance, of recklessness, depending on who was telling the story. Jack, meanwhile, was cast as everything from a modern-day Prince Charming to a gold digger manipulating his way into fortune. But no one asked them, not once. Jack first saw the coverage on a flickering TV at a gas station. He was just grabbing a coffee. Then he saw his own face next to Linda's and felt his stomach twist, not with fear, but with the sinking knowledge that their safe little world had just been shattered. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Missed calls, unknown numbers, voicemail after voicemail. He didn't answer any of them, but the silence that cut deepest came from Linda. She had vanished. No text, no call, no message. What Jack didn't know was that Linda hadn't gone silent by choice. The moment the story broke, her father summoned her back to the estate like a general calling a soldier to the front lines. The iron gates that once opened softly now slammed shut behind her. Her phone was taken. Her access to the outside world cut off. In her father's study, she stood still while he raged. "You've humiliated this family," he barked. "Gallivanting around the city with a taxi driver? Do you have any idea what the board is saying?" But Linda didn't flinch. "They're saying I'm human, and maybe that's what this family needs." That moment took unimaginable strength. Real-life accounts from people raised in elite, high-pressure environments confirm how terrifying it is to challenge family legacy. Your worth is tied to image. Your decisions are never just yours. And to defy that, it's not just rebellion, it's personal revolution. But Linda held her ground even when her father tried to crush the truth with threats. "He's using you," he hissed. "No," she replied, her voice trembling, but sure. "He's the only one who's never asked for anything from me." Meanwhile, Jack received his own message, an envelope delivered by hand, stamped with the Fairchild crest. It wasn't an invitation. It was a bribe. Inside was a non-disclosure agreement and a check. All he had to do was sign and disappear. No contact with Linda, no more press, no more problems. This is a moment many viewers will resonate with, not because we've all been offered hush money, but because we've all been faced with decisions that test our values. Do you stand your ground even when it's easier to take the offer and walk away? Or do you fold, telling yourself it's just the way things work? Jack didn't hesitate. He pushed the envelope back across the table and stood. "I didn't help your daughter to get anything," he said. "I helped her because she looked like she was drowning." Richard Fairchild leaned forward, cold and confident. "You think you belong in her world?" And Jack, steady as ever, replied, "I don't need to belong to her world. I just need to be worthy of her. And you don't get to decide that." That line wasn't just defiance, it was truth, the kind that echoes in your chest long after it's spoken. Jack walked out of that building with no money, no promises, no security, just integrity. And sometimes that's the only thing you need. That night he climbed to the rooftop of his apartment and sat beneath the stars. Somewhere out there, Linda was locked behind gates and glass, but they were still under the same sky. He didn't know what came next, but he knew he would wait, and when the moment came, he'd be ready. The city moved on as cities do. Headlines faded, new scandals rose, and the world began to forget the whirlwind story of an heiress and a taxi driver. But Linda didn't forget, and she couldn't move on because something in her heart refused to let go of the man who had shown her what safety really felt like. In her childhood room filled with expensive furniture and walls that never heard laughter, Linda sat staring at her laptop. The media had told their version of the story. Her father had shut every door, but no one had heard her voice. So she started to type, not as Linda Fairchild, not as a billionaire's daughter, but as a girl who had once sat shivering in the back of a taxi rescued by someone who never asked for her name. She titled the post, "The Rain and the Man Who Saved Me." And in that quiet room, she wrote the truth, every detail. The night she ran, the fear in the alley, Jack's voice cutting through the dark, their grilled cheese dinners, the fireworks, the way he never once asked her for anything. Her words weren't dramatic. They were raw, honest, human. "I don't know where he is now," she wrote in the final paragraph, "but if you see him, tell him I still remember the silence in the cab, the safety in his presence, and how he never once asked for anything in return. Tell him I miss him." She clicked publish, closed the laptop, and waited. By morning, the post had gone viral. Thousands of comments flooded in. People from around the world shared the story, people who had been helped by strangers, people who had lost someone without closure, people who still believed in love that didn't come with terms and conditions. The story touched a nerve. It wasn't about money scandal or rebellion. It was about humanity, about kindness that asked for nothing back. A week later, Linda received an invitation to appear on a morning talk show. The producers promised to focus on the story, not the scandal. She hesitated, terrified that her words would be twisted again, but then remembered Jack's quiet courage. So she said yes. On the morning of the interview, she dressed simply. No designer dress, no diamond earrings, just a soft blue blouse and hair tucked behind her ears. When the lights came on and the cameras rolled, she looked straight ahead and told the world her story again, but this time in her own words. "I didn't fall in love with a fairy tale," she said softly. "I found something real, and I lost it because of fear." The host leaned forward. If he were watching right now, what would you say? Linda paused, her voice barely more than a whisper. I'd say come back. Silence. Then in the corner of the studio, someone stood up. A shadow in the aisle. The audience gasped. Linda turned eyes wide. And there he was. Jack. Hair a little longer. Jacket still simple. Eyes steady. Real. He walked slowly toward her, looking like he wasn't sure if he belonged there. But Linda didn't wait. She ran past cameras, past lights straight into his arms. The studio exploded in applause. Flashes burst like fireworks, but Jack and Linda didn't notice. In that moment, they weren't a viral story. They were just two people holding on to something they thought they'd lost. I read it, Jack said, his voice low. I meant every word, she replied, tears in her eyes. And just like that, the silence that had haunted them both finally broke. Let's pause here to recognize how powerful vulnerability can be. In a world that glorifies stoicism, especially among men, Jack's decision to show up was a radical act of emotional bravery. He didn't come to be the hero of a story. He came because he believed in it again. Linda's courage was just as bold. She used her voice not to restore her image, but to restore her truth. These moments matter not just for them, but for all of us, because they remind us that love doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and waiting for the right time to return. The applause continued. The internet lit up again, but this time the tone changed. No longer scandal. Now it was celebration. Headlines softened. Second chance at real love. Taxi drivers' loyalty moves millions. Love wins where money fails. Social media buzzed with support. Hashtags like Chushy Jack and Linda and Yashai Real Love trended. Even celebrities chimed in, praising the story's authenticity and heart. Of course, critics still whispered. Tabloids speculated. High society frowned behind champagne glasses. But for the first time, Linda and Jack didn't care. They didn't have to hide anymore. And they weren't going to. That moment on live TV wasn't closure. It was a beginning. After the cameras dimmed and the hashtags slowly faded, real life returned. But this time it wasn't filled with scandal or hiding. It was filled with choice. Jack and Linda could have capitalized on their story. They could have signed book deals, sold the film, rights leaned into the fame. But they didn't. Instead, they chose something simple and incredibly rare in a world driven by spectacle, a quiet life built from truth. They moved into a modest third-floor apartment in a brownstone with creaky stairs and a heater that rattled in the winter. The place wasn't fancy. The furniture didn't match. But it was theirs. And for the first time, both of them felt like they were exactly where they were meant to be. Jack kept driving his taxi not for the money, but because he loved the rhythm of the city, the people, the unpredictable heartbeat of the streets. Linda didn't go back to the estate. She didn't return to high society fundraisers or corporate banquets. Instead, she focused on something that had started as a passing thought during one of their late-night drives. One night, Jack had said quietly, I wish more people could feel safe just stepping into a car. And Linda had looked at him and said, then let's give them that. That conversation planted the seed for what would become something extraordinary. They launched a project called Taxi of Hope. It started small, just Jack's cab, offering free rides to people in crisis, elderly passengers trying to make medical appointments, single parents without a car, young women who didn't feel safe waiting for a stranger. Word spread. A second cab was donated, then a third. Mechanics offered to help keep them running. Local shops chipped in to cover fuel, and more drivers volunteered not for pay but for purpose. Jack drove by day, and at night Linda managed the growing logistics. She built the website. She coordinated routes. She handled donations but refused to use her father's name or money to fund any of it. This isn't charity, she often said. It's a thank you. And it really was. A thank you to Jack, to every driver who chooses to care, to every stranger who decides to stop instead of driving past. This wasn't a business. It was a movement. And while their project grew, so did they. Their love wasn't perfect. There were disagreements, moments of fear, questions about the future, but it was real, grounded, strong in a way that only comes from shared struggle. Every morning, Jack made breakfast, his eggs slightly overcooked, his toast often uneven. Every night, Linda teased him about how he folded the laundry all wrong. Their apartment filled with little things plants with names mismatched coffee mugs, dog-eared books, and moments that didn't need to be documented or posted. That's the beauty of real love. It doesn't need an audience. It just needs attention. Eventually, the conversation turned to marriage. Not a grand proposal with a flash mob or a viral video. Just a quiet moment sitting on the couch watching city lights flicker through the window. "Do you want to do this?" Jack asked, holding her hand. "Yeah," Linda said, smiling. "I really do." And so they planned a wedding that fit their story, not their status. No ballroom, no $1,000 centerpieces, no champagne towers. They chose the park where they had first shared silence, the same one where Jack had taken her after that terrifying night in the rain. Folding chairs, string lights, a few blankets in case it got chilly. Guests weren't celebrities or CEOs. They were people Jack had once driven, like Mrs. Holloway, the 82-year-old, who he helped to her weekly eye appointments. Or Carla, the single mom who called Jack when she went into labor and had no one else. Or little Ava, who once left her stuffed rabbit in the back seat and Jack drove across town that same night just to return it. Each guest brought a flower. Not store-bought bouquets, just a single flower, hand-picked, meaningful, offered with love. And together they created a bouquet that Linda carried down the aisle. Jack stood under the same tree where they had watched fireworks wearing a simple gray suit. Linda walked down the aisle in a dress she had sewn parts of by hand, not because she couldn't afford better, but because she didn't need better. That dress, like their story, was imperfect, but it was real. And in front of the people who mattered, they said their vows. Jack's voice cracked as he said, "I don't promise perfect, but I promise real." And Linda, with eyes brimming with tears, replied, "You gave me something I never knew I needed, a reason to believe in someone again." They kissed to the sound of cheers and birdsong, and the city humming quietly around them. After the ceremony, they sat on the hood of Jack's taxi one more time. Just like before. No cameras, no script, just the two of them. Linda leaned against his shoulder, watching the sun sink into the horizon. "I used to think love had to come with chandeliers and champagne," she whispered. "But all I ever needed was someone brave enough to stop." Jack didn't say anything. He just took her hand and held it like he never planned to let go. And maybe that's what this entire story has been about. Not grand gestures, not perfect timing, not fairy tale endings, but about the power of one small moment, one act of kindness, one decision to stop. Because sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. A year after Jack first stopped his cab on that rainy street, the world looked different. But not because the world had changed, because they had. The yellow taxi, the same one that had pulled up beside a crying girl on a stormy night, now bore a new name painted in bold, cheerful letters, Taxi of Hope. What started as one man's instinct to help had become a network, a community, a mission. Drivers from all corners of the city volunteered to join. Local families donated snacks and blankets. Mechanics offered free maintenance. People who had never spoken to each other now stood side by side, united by something simple but powerful, the belief that kindness still matters. And if you think this sounds too idealistic to be real, think again. All over the world, grassroots movements like this one are changing lives. In New York, there's an organization where retired cab drivers provide free rides to the elderly. In London, volunteer drivers take kids to hospital appointments when their parents can't. These stories don't make the front page, but they remind us what's possible when someone decides to care. Jack and Linda didn't just want to love each other, they wanted to build something that reflected that love. And so they did. Their apartment remained modest. Their routine stayed simple, but their days were full. Linda worked from a second-hand desk beside the window, organizing shifts and emails, planning fundraisers, and replying to every thank you note that came in. Jack still drove every week, his taxi often filled with laughter, quiet conversations, or sometimes just soft music and silence, because even that can be healing. One afternoon, Jack picked up a teenage boy named Miguel, who had missed his bus and was scared he'd lose his job if he was late. Jack got him there with minutes to spare and left a note on the dashboard. "You've got this." A week later, Miguel came back and asked to volunteer on weekends. That's what this story's made of, not big donations, but ripples of kindness that kept going. And that's the real legacy of what Jack and Linda built. Not fame, not wealth, but lives touched in quiet ways. There was also something else they shared during this time stories. Jack kept a small notebook in his glove compartment where he wrote down short quotes or lines from people he met. Linda began turning those stories into blog posts, which grew into a digital newsletter that eventually had thousands of subscribers. They called it Roadside Light because that's what it felt like. Tiny moments that lit the way forward. And through all of this, they stayed grounded. They took walks every night, rain or shine. They spent weekends cooking meals together, sometimes burning the toast and laughing about it. They celebrated small wins like getting a fourth taxi on the road or receiving a thank you card from a school teacher they'd helped last winter. But they also faced challenges. Funding ran low at times. Linda's father, though silent publicly, occasionally sent messages through intermediaries offering deals or second chances. They ignored them because nothing could buy back the peace they'd earned. Their story eventually became a book written by someone else, yes, but with their permission. They agreed only because the proceeds went to expanding Taxi of Hope. They never wanted a spotlight, but they learned that sometimes sharing your story isn't about attention. It's about permission. Permission for others to hope again, to believe in love, to choose kindness. The last scene I'll share with you isn't dramatic. It isn't televised. It's just a quiet morning. Jack and Linda sitting at their tiny kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window, two mugs of coffee steaming beside them. Linda reading a letter from someone who had once considered giving up until one of their drivers showed up, smiled and said, "I've got you." Jack listening, eyes soft, nodding slowly. And that's when Linda says, "We didn't just fall in love, Jack. We built something that matters." And Jack, ever the quiet one, just replies, "Yeah." And it all started because I stopped the car. So here's the lesson. In a world that rushes past pain, ignores the silent cries, and tells us to keep moving, this story asks us to do the opposite, to slow down, to listen, to see, because sometimes love doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives as headlights in the rain. Sometimes it begins not with a kiss or a date, but with a question as simple as, "Are you okay?" And when you answer that question with action, with empathy, you don't just change someone's night. You might change their life, maybe even your own. So the next time you see someone who looks like they need help, ask yourself, will I keep driving or will I stop?